Okay, so this lecture is about sexual orientation and sexual diversity. So there are some things that we are going to go over in this lecture. So the first things that we're going to talk about are important terms that we really need to know in order for us to further our understandings within the lecture. And then we're going to be going over the gender unicorn. And then lastly, we're going to cover heterosexism and the effects associated with heterosexism. So how does heterosexism affect us within the system? So these are a lot. I recognize there are a lot of things that are on the screen, but do not worry. I will make sure to go through these terms as outlined within your book. So the first one is sexual orientation. So this is really in reference to an identifier that a person uses to describe their romantic and or their sexual relationships, feelings towards a specific person. Um, Now, with sexual orientation, there are a wide array that have been classified. The first one, heterosexual. This is an identifier used to describe a romantic and sexual attraction to a person of the opposite gender. We're going to be talking a lot about heterosexuality and the privileges associated with that particular sexual orientation. Homosexual, a lot of time, this is one of the identifiers that's we've moved away from. And the only reason why I'm putting it up here is because it's important to recognize what it means, so forth and so on. So this is an identifier used to describe romantic and sexual attraction to a person of the same gender. So moving with that, there are different identifiers that can be associated with homosexual. But for the time being, I want y'all to know that this is very distinct from being gay or being lesbian. If a person identifies themselves as gay or lesbian or homosexual, however, it is important to respect that person's sexual orientation and to identify the way that they so choose. Gay, identifier used to describe a man's romantic and sexual attraction to a man. And then lesbian, identifier used to describe a woman's romantic and sexual attraction to a woman. Bisexual is an identifier used to describe a romantic and sexual attraction to a person of the opposite or and the same gender. So with bisexuality, and this is one of the least discussed topics within like sexual orientations. In addition to pansexual and asexual, bisexuality has been it's been met with stigmatization, mainly because there's a lot of bias towards people who identify as bisexual, whether it be a man or a woman. Those who identify as bisexual, they're considered confused. There are also some stigmatized assumptions about people who identify as bisexual in their relationships, that they are cheaters, that they are less likely to be faithful, so forth and so on. So when it comes to bisexuality in particular, there's a lot of stigmatization around that, even within the LG community, okay, and within the overall within heterosexism, of course. Pansexual. This is an identifier used to describe romantic and sexual attraction to persons of any gender. So this can be individuals who identify as cisgender or who identify as transgender. The point is, for individuals who identify as pansexual, there's a romantic and sexual attraction to really any gender. Now, one of the newer, it's not a newer identifier. This is one that has, it's one that has been recently discussed. There has been a lot of conversations about it. Asexuality. Now, within like the day-to-day conversations, when we talk about asexuality, this is the conversation tends to be that people who are asexual do not experience any sexual feeling, sexual attraction, so forth and so on. However, it has been identified that people who identify as asexual, they do experience sexual attraction and feelings, so forth and so on. That's the point. But they're less likely to experience it. So within the court, within this lecture, what I really want y'all to know is that this is an identifier that is used to describe romantic attraction to folks, but there are rare experiences of sexual attraction. The point is, that's not to say that people who are asexual do not experience any form of sexual feelings, any form of sexual attraction, may not want sex. That's not to say that they don't do that at all or experience those feelings at all. They're very rare, they're less likely to experience. So it's really important to recognize that that there is some experience of sexual attraction. Questioning. So this identifier is used to describe a person who is really unsure about their sexual orientation and their gender identity. Okay, so this is really where a person is not sure if their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity at that point are very congruent. So there's some uncertainty about that. There's also some uncertainty about someone in terms of sexual orientation. They may not be fully certain about their romantic or sexual attraction towards a certain gender or genders, what you may have. And then sexual diversity. So this is basically it encompasses all the sex characteristics, sexual orientations, and gender identities. It's also really important to note that there isn't a lot of inclusion about different forms of relationships, romantic relationships. So I mentioned not pansexual. I meant to include polyamorous relationships, just as an example. To be quite clear, within heterosexism, there is, and I'll be very brief in explaining this, and it's very watered down, heteronormativity, and that's basically that, anything that is besides the heterosexual romantic relationship is wrong. There's also this notion as well that is very alive in heterosexism, that relationships should be not only just heterosexual, but should be monogamous. And that is not the case from what we have seen within research. You have polyamorous relationships. So this is where, this is not like polygamy or having two partners. What may you have? Polyamory is more where each individual is in a relationship with each other, and the power within those relationships inside there are shared. Okay, so this is not like polygamy, which is typically what you've observed within faiths, different faiths, in particular the Mormon faith. But with polyamory, the relationship is shared shared amongst individuals within those relationships, and that's really important to recognize. Okay. Also, when it comes to sex, or really anything with sex, there's this assumption that um, sex is to be uh, focused mainly on traditional sexual positions like missionary. To be quite clear, that's not true. And this is just information for your knowledge, just to be quite clear. So that does encompass like, that is part of heterosexism. And that's something that I just want to be clear about, and just to introduce it to you, because your book doesn't have too much about it. But that's pretty much it. And if you have any questions about polyamory, or anything about anything related to the different kinds of relationships, please tell me. Please ask me, and I'll go over that the best way that I can in email. All right, so let's get started on the gender unicorn. So this here is the gender unicorn. So the first thing that we're going to go over is gender identity. So with gender identity, that is, if you look here where the thought cloud is, that is more along the lines of your own conception of your gender. And notice that you have these little dials, well, not dials, but it's almost like it's on that spectrum. So you have female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, and other genders. So when it comes to gender identity, that's more along the lines of your conception of your gender identity. Now, gender expression, if we look here where the green dots are, that's more along the lines of how you express your gender. Is it more feminine? Is it more masculine? Is it a mixture of both? So when it comes to gender expression, it's like I mentioned, it's how you express your own conception of your gender. Sex assigned at birth. So if you notice here in this area, they have like the little DNA, the DNA structure. So this is in reference to your genitals. So you have female, which is the vagina, and then you have male, the penis, and then you have other or intersex. So those who are born intersex, the thing about it is that there is, when the baby is born, typically doctors will look at the baby's genitals to determine the sex, the biological sex, or the sex assigned at birth. In some cases, there are babies who may have a mixture of they might have like a penis, they may have a vagina at the same time. They may, as they grow up, they may have an embryo. The point is, when it comes to those who are intersex, their sex assigned at birth is, according to the doctors, it's harder to identify. So those who have been identified as, let me say this. So going back, when the doctors are doing this, there are cases where doctors have chosen what sex assigned at birth that baby is, whenever there have been ambiguous physical characteristics of the genitals. Some cases the parents are consulted, in other cases it is not. So that's something that is a very, very big topic. Those who have been identified as intersex, there is a lot of stigma around those who were born intersex, and there's a lot more research coming out about that stigmatization, the impacts of that stigmatization on mental health on those who were born intersex. Okay. Now, physically attracted, so physical attraction is like located here, this heart. So physical attraction is more along the lines of like your sexual attraction, like you're feeling you're feeling these sexual feelings. You feel aroused, and this can be in reference to to women, to men, both, or to other genders, or all. So physical attraction is more along the lines of what you feel physically about an individual. And then emotionally attracted to, this is more along the lines of like romantic feelings. So do you have romantic feelings for a woman? Do you have romantic feelings for a man? Do you have romantic feelings for someone who identifies as non-binary? The point is, with physical and emotional attraction, you can experience physical attraction to women, and you can be physically attracted to men, and be emotionally attracted to men as well. So really, when you look at all of these different things, it's not your either or. To be quite clear, if you think of it like dials, one dial can be turned up, and the other one can be just a little bit down. So the point is, when it comes to your gender identity, gender expression, physical attraction, emotional attraction, these are all along the lines of ranges. Even to some extent, your sex assigned at birth. Okay. Certain people may have been exposed to a lot more testosterone or estrogen or so forth and so on, or a mixture of, our equal mixture of both within the womb. So overall, when we're looking at gender identity, express all these different terms, your biological factors, as well as social cultural factors, as well as psychological factors, they all interact with each other to produce like your identity, how you express that, your attraction, so forth and so on. So it's really important to recognize the role that these biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors play a role in all of that. So now we're moving on to heterosexism. So we're going to talk about what it is, what it focuses on, so forth and so on. So if we're looking at the screen, the addressing model, we're going to be focusing on these S, sexual orientation. And those who are part of that privileged group are those who identify as heterosexuals. So with heterosexism, really what it is this system, this institution that perpetuates and by itself reinforces heterosexual norms and standards. It creates this notion of shoulds, that people should be heterosexual. People should identify as cisgender. That people should, that their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth should match. Okay. And within this system, it privileges people who identify as heterosexual. And I will talk a little bit about trans oppression as well. It also privileges people who identify as cisgender. So with heterosexism, it has really come a long way. When we first started talking about it, well, within history, the discussion around heterosexism, it was there, but it wasn't labeled. So what we have found is that, you know, as time went on, uh, what we have recognized is that gender is fluid, gender identity is fluid, sexual attraction and romantic attraction is fluid. However, it became a problem when it became institutionalized. And this is like within the, like whenever like the Victorian era came about, if I'm correct. Um, so overall, as time went on, there were conversations around heterosexism that were happening. They just weren't labeled. So we're going to talk about like the manifestations of heterosexism. So this is overt and covert, excuse me. So this may take the form of pity. So people who are part of that privileged group, who are part of the dominant group, they may experience sympathy for those who identify as, for those who don't identify as heterosexual. And a lot of times it's more along the lines of, oh, I feel sorry for you because you can't be who you are. And what we know about sympathy, that is not the best response. Because really with sympathy it's if you imagine yourself looking down in a hole, and there's like a fox in that hole, and you're like, and that person is the person that's inside the hole is saying, help me, I'm in this dark place, I'm really stuck. Sympathy is going in and saying, ooh man, that really does suck. It could be worse. At least you're in this hole. It's more along the lines of finding a silver lining and trying to make that person feel better. Whereas the appropriate response would be some form of empathy. So being able to go down to that person's level and saying, man, that's a lot. I'm just so happy that you told me. So the point is, when it comes to sympathy continues to perpetuate this form of pity. Oh, I'm sorry that you cannot be who you are. Okay. When it comes to heterosexism, with it being very, very, very subtle, it's really difficult to combat. And when it becomes difficult to combat, um, it makes it harder to really address it. And the reason why is because of how the struggles we have to come to define it. Okay. So when we first started out with talking about heterosexism, we talked about the more active form. So the more active form was called homophobia. So with this particular form of heterosexism, this was characterized as like the fear and hatred of those who love and are attracted emotionally and sexually to those of the same sex. Now, when we were having that conversation about homophobia, or what we call homophobia, this included prejudice, discrimination, harassment, and also acts of violence that were based upon fear and hatred. And what has come from that conversation were some related topics like lesophobia. So the fear and hatred, so forth and so on, of women who are attracted to other women, biphobia, asexual oppression as well. So while that term homophobia isn't really used in preference to heterosexism, that is a very common, it's still a very common concept that is discussed in daily conversation, to be quite frank. And if you think about it, when you think about homophobia, the key word there is like homophobia. Is that something to fear? And that's not true in some cases. Now, we recognize from the system of socialization that fear is at the center of um, that cycle. However, with phobia, if we look into the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, the DSM, this is the diagnostic tool for psychologists and other mental health professionals. Phobia is an irrational fear. Now, when we look at homophobia, can we really say that that's an irrational fear? For some people it is, and you have to recognize that case by case basis on whether that is a phobia. But as of right now, I haven't heard of someone being diagnosed with homophobia, to be quite frank. So for the purposes of like this lecture, I'm not going to refer to homophobia. That's just historical stuff for your knowledge. Instead, I will refer to heterosexism. We're also going to be talking about trans oppression, and I will also outline this in a lot more detail in the gender sexism chapter. But just so you know about it, a lot of times within like the LGBT, like the acronym, trans oppression is consistently included in here. And while it is important to recognize, like, to always recognize trans oppression, I want to be clear that this is not concerning about sexual orientation. This is more along the lines of the exclusion of those who do not identify with their sex assigned at birth. So this isn't anything about sexual orientation or sexual attraction. No, not at all. So I just want to be very, very clear about that. Okay. However, your book does outline it within that chapter, but to be quite clear, I will go over it in a lot more detail within the sexism gender chapter. But for right now, I just want to give a quick and brief introduction to trans oppression. So what we do know about trans oppression, this is focused on the marginalization and exclusion of people who do not identify with their sex assigned at birth. This operates on every level, the systemic, the interpersonal, and personal levels. So what we have documented, what we have seen is that there are many acts of violence against people who identify as trans. The average lifespan, from what research suggests, it is 35 years old. Now that is very, very, very young. Those who are younger people, so like the youth who identify as trans, they do experience, they're more likely to experience homelessness, psychological distress, depression, so forth and so on. So when we look at this particular oppression as a whole, there's this experience of prejudice and discrimination. And on top of that, misrecognition, or what is also known as misgendering. We do have research that says that misgendering a person who is trans creates that psychological harm, creates distress. So like we talked about microaggressions a couple chapters ago, that is a very serious microaggression. So if someone is experiencing this particular microaggression over and over and over and over and over and over again, One more microaggression can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And it's just as severe as an act of discrimination. Okay. So that's something really, really important to recognize, that, misgendering somebody is very, very serious, and it creates harm for that person, to be quite frank. Okay. So when it comes to heterosexism, like I mentioned before, it operates on the systemic, the interpersonal, and the personal level. So with the institution, one of the most recent ones was the conversation around same-sex marriage. So within the institution, there has been a long history of denial and lack of recognition of legal and human rights of people who identify as LGB. Okay, to be quite frank, same-sex marriage was legalized in 2015. It's 2020. That was like 5 years ago. I was still in college back then. And like, to be quite frank, there are still political lawmakers proposing laws that that attack LGBT rights, and also attack the rights of people who identify as trans. So really, there are a lot of laws. There's a lot of lawmakers who do push back on those human rights. Another big one, adoption. So there are a lot of cases where you have couples who are of the same gender, or so forth and so on, who want to adopt, and they're less likely to, they are typically denied services to adopt a child. And a lot of times it's from this notion that same-sex couples are not going to take care of that child better than a couple of the opposite gender. And that's not true. What we have from research, children who are adopted children who are whose parents are of the same sex, who are in the same-sex marriage, so forth and so on, they do just as well as children who children of opposite gender parents. Okay, so to be quite clear, there's a lot of misconceptions that fuel discriminations, fuel prejudices, and even the legal and human rights around people within the LGBTQ plus community. Okay. Another one, barriers to healthcare. So this is a big one for folks who identify transgender. A lot of times there are a lot of barriers when it comes to receiving healthcare. What we do know is that folks who do identify as trans, they're less likely to get medical interventions. And a lot of times it's just bullshit, if you ask me. But when it comes to physical treatments, there's doctors who do misgender that patient. So really, when it comes to healthcare, there's a lot of stuff that creates problems, and there's not a lot of laws that are put in place to protect those folks. Another one, the maintenance of heterosexist philosophies. So we see this a lot within a lot of times, right? When there are ultra conservative religious philosophies that are consistently promoted. A lot of times whenever you have the conservative lawmakers propose these laws they propose these laws about pushing back on the human rights, legal rights of those within the LGBT community too. There's sightings of scripture, and we hear silence from people who say they're against it, but they're not saying anything at all. The point that I'm trying to make is there isn't a lot of pushback on people from these religious institutions. And what we constantly see is that these big majority-based institutions, and I'm specifically referring to Christianity, there a lot of times there's a lack of validation from that institution. Most often it is Protestant Christians promoting this lack of validation. So taken together, when we're looking at it from an institutional level, there are a lot of things that create barriers and impedes upon the life of those within the LGBT community. Okay. Now, the interpersonal and personal, these go hand in hand because these are more along the lines of how other people relate to you, treat you, and how you treat or how you engage with other people. So much like in other oppressions we have seen so far, there's prejudice, discrimination, violence, and microaggressions. So with microaggressions, these are interesting in particular because if we remember from that chapter on oppressions, microaggressions are very, very, very common, and those who deliver microaggressions don't even know that they are delivering them. They think of them as harmless. Now, while these statements are very subtle and very and appear to be harmless, they're actually very innocuous and very insidious because they seem so subtle. So the next part, what I want to talk about is privileges. So identification with 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 being heterosexual, there are privileges that are associated with that identity. So I'm gonna switch over my screen here. So I'm gonna go here. Okay. Okay. So what you should see is this article that I pulled up here, 30 plus examples of heterosexual or straight privileges. So first, it brings up a map. Oh, by the way, this was by Sam Kellerman. I like the picture. So this is a map. These are states where you can be fired for being gay. So the darker the color, the more likely there is the possibility of discrimination, to be quite frank. So look at this. This is quite a lot. Here we are in Louisiana. And notice how so moving more in the direction of the South within like those southern states, the darker it gets. Okay. So that's just to make note. And I will make sure to provide y'all with the link on your pages. All right. So with being straight, with being heterosexual, there are some unearned benefits. That's a result. So let's see. So number one, receiving public recognition and support for an intimate relationship. Expressing affection in most social situations and not expecting hostile or violent reactions. Living with your partner openly. Expressing pain when a relationship ends from death or separation and receiving support from others. Receiving social acceptance from neighbors, colleagues, and good friends. Having role models of your gender and sexual orientation. Having positive and accurate media images of people with whom you can identify. Okay. So raising, adopting, and teaching children without people believing that you will molest them or force them into your sexuality. A big one. Receiving paid leave from employment when grieving the death of your spouse. A very awkward one, and one that is very, out there for folks. Assuming strangers won't ask, how does sex work for you, or other too personal questions. So really, when you continue down the list, there are a lot more. Right, so I'm just going to continue to scroll down here. And then there's also 30 examples of cisgender privilege. So we're going to move over here. All right. So, all right, here we go. So you can use public restrooms without fear of verbal abuse, physical intimidation, or arrest. You can use public facilities. Strangers don't assume they can ask you what your genitals look like and how you have sex. Your validity as a man, woman, human is not based on how much surgery you've had or how well you pass as non-transgender, excuse me. You can reasonably assume that your ability to acquire a job, rent an apartment, and secure a loan will not be denied on the basis of your gender identity and expression. If you end up in the emergency room, you do not have to worry that your gender will keep you from receiving appropriate treatment or that all your medical issues will be seen as a result of your gender. All right, so let's go back to the slide. So taken together, one thing, if you don't take anything away from this lecture, is that recognition of your privilege. If you identify as cisgender or if you identify as heterosexual, it's really important in order for you to, reduce the stigma, right? And be really a kind human. You have to be aware of your own stuff. It's really important to know who you are as an individual, and as well as how you're different and similar to people with like LGBT identification and trans identification, okay? Because if you don't have a good sense of who you are as a human, then everything else is not going to fit, okay? Knowledge. So this is a big one. Get knowledge. Now, don't go up to people who are, don't go up to people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, pansexual, and seek their knowledge. Do not do that, because they're not there to teach you. Instead, learn on your own time. So it can be as something as simple as learning about the terms, identifications, uh, recognizing your own privileges, looking at the literature, looking at research, listening to stories of those from that community. So really don't seek to be educated, educate yourself, be active in that. Now, when it comes to doing the work, right, skills and actions, these go hand in hand. And to be quite frank, doing the work is hard, because when you're in the presence of other people who may not see heterosexism as a problem, it's going to be hard to really articulate those concerns, when there are other people who do not believe in that oppression. And it's a lot more important to communicate what you do know. And to be quite frank, starting out immediately is going to be hard. But as you continue with that process, it gets to be a lot easier. And even then, by communicating what you know, then doing the work, taking action, right? This might include standing up for those who identify as LGBT or trans, and trans. And it could include you pushing back against, like, maybe that family member at like Thanksgiving, saying, hey, that's not okay. But to be quite clear, doing that work is hard because there's some fear associated with that, right? So going back to that cycle of socialization, you either do something or you do nothing. And be quite frank, it's hard work, but it's important to know that if you go in there trying to change other people's minds, that's when that work becomes harder, because the goal is not to change other people's minds. You have to let other people know on their own and learn on their own. And trying to change their mind is not, it may strengthen their own beliefs about that oppression. So it's really for you to do that work. You clear up your own understanding about it, and you dismantling or destigmatizing those negative consequences around LGBT and transgender identification. Okay. So moving forward, don't declare yourself an ally. Your actions have to be determined by the members. So if you declare yourself as an ally and say, look at what I'm doing, that tends to take away from those members, okay? Having a really good understanding of your own gender, of your own sexual identity, and being comfortable with that can really help out as well, especially when it comes to allyship. Knowing who you are, and I said it in the last slide, is really, really important. And then lastly, interact with those from that community. Like, it's hard to be an ally when you yourself haven't interacted with those from the community. Now, what I'm not saying is go out and be like, hello, person, hello, person who identifies as gay or as lesbian. Don't do that. That's weird, first off. And then you're just picking. And then it begs the question of, are you doing the work because you want to do the work, or are you doing the work to look good, to be quite clear. So make sure there's that genuine interest in that person, because then you're just using them as a means to an end. And then and as a result, you're furthering that type of oppression. So we talked about a lot of different things in here. Oops. So we talked about a lot of different things in here. We talked about the gender unicorn. We talked about these terms. We talked about heterosexism, what that looks like. We talked about cis and heterosexual privilege and the ways that you can become an ally. So overall, with this lecture, heterosexism is very pervasive, and it's very, very subtle. However, just because it's pervasive and subtle, that does not mean that we cannot fight against it. While it's harder to combat, that doesn't mean it's impossible. And one way of combating heterosexism is knowing what you can do. While you yourself at an individual level may not change the whole system, you can do something at your own individual level. Okay. So really, that's an important point that I want folks to take away from this lecture. Any questions, please feel free to email me. That's it.